Well, welcome to our latest PCD members discussion. Every Wednesday at 2, we bring the freshest content from the private wealth sector direct to our members. And today we're joined on Zoom by a group of PCD members, plus a YouTube live stream link to a much broader audience from advisors around the world. So welcome to everyone. We've got an expert panel today to discuss all aspects of this specialist asset class. We did a luxury asset feature in January that was very well received by our community, and we're building with a specialist sort of in-depth session on marine assets today. I've got a panel of 6 expert speakers that we're going to come to individually for some insight and what they're seeing coming across their desk to give you ideas and inspirations how you can collaborate, work together, tap into the latest trends. We'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then in the last 15 minutes, we will go into breakout rooms with our Zoom audience. We'll say bye-bye to our YouTube live stream audience at that point. So looking forward to a fantastic discussion. We always like to hear from our audience on Zoom on the chat function. So do put your questions, comments, thoughts into the chat, and I'll bring it to each of our panelists live as we go through, or pull it back and pose the questions that you want to have answered directly live to them as we move through. So we're going to kick off first of all with Siobhan Silk from Ince in London, who's a transactional lawyer focused on the super yacht sector. Good afternoon, Siobhan.
Hi, David. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for opening up the session today, where we're gonna talk about with you just about how you've seen transactions being affected during this unique time of COVID. I mean, what's your perception since March of how sales have been affected? What's the trend in transaction volume in your area around super yacht sector?
Well, we've heard and we've seen coming across our desks, there's been a very strong and steady stream of sales since last March. I think there was a slight stall in the market in March of last year when the pandemic first hit, and the industry was reacting and everyone was trying to find their feet. And at that point, Europe was in various stages of lockdown. But I've been quite impressed with the kind of innovation that our team and others have shown in the deals across our industry, have shown in getting kind of deals over the line. It seems to me, from talking to sale and purchase brokers, that despite what people probably initially thought or predicted, we're very much in a seller's market. For example, I was involved in a deal last year where the yacht had to be sold quite quickly. She had quite a checkered past, and she went under offer within a couple of days, which was great result for our client who was selling. That offer was gazumped within a few days, even before we got the first contract signed, and that second offer was gazumped 48 hours later. So the seller ended up getting really a very good favourable sales price. And it kind of shows that there's definitely a group of buyers out there, not necessarily first-time buyers, but experienced buyers who are cash rich and who are looking for a good deal. And this yacht was in the kind of 50 to 60 metre market. She was built by a reputable yard. She just needed a bit of TLC. But I have heard that from a group of brokers that in their experience, they've completed a larger number of sales in the 70 metre plus category than in the previous pre-COVID year. So I don't think it's impacted as much as people probably initially thought. And I'd be cautious to say that although for me, there's always a bit of a lull in kind of January, February, which is usually expected, and there is at the moment, that all the indicators point upwards. And so I think with vaccine rollout in the UK and across Europe and the world, I think it will continue on that upward trajectory.
Well, thank you. It's encouraging to hear that the team was resilient to complete transaction that came through, and that there was consistent demand. As you say, the cash-rich buyer who's already intended on making these kind of purchases was still at the table. I mean, obviously last September, Monaco Yacht Show was cancelled in some quite difficult circumstances for all event operators. Do you think, the community of advisors around clients buying yachts is quite tight-knit? Do you think that the absence of sort of trade shows has an impact, or do you think we've got over all of that with technology and existing networks that are in place helping these deals to continue?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I think up until now, people have always debated, how much the yacht shows add. Um, but from what I've been working on, and from talking to sell and purchase brokers, in terms of sales of super yachts, I don't believe it's really had an impact, not a negative impact anyway. I was talking to a broker the other day who was recounting that they had just sold a 60-meter plus yacht, and the owners never even stepped on board. And I'm hearing this over and over again. This is not an isolated event. I heard it years ago, and everyone kind of gasped, like, "How crazy!" But nowadays, I think it's happening more and more, and not just with secondhand sale and purchase, but also with yards are selling this way, and multiple sales happening. And like you say, one of the byproducts of restricting international travel is that people have had to embrace technology. And a lot of the success of these virtual sales is down to the technology. The virtual 360 tours have really come into their own. And the technology, I think, is really important because it's accessible, it's user-friendly, and everybody is using it. And I think our industry has had a new digital outlook, which has allowed them now probably to reach newer audiences in further flung places and much quicker. But I think the interesting point here is to watch how it plays out in the next 12 months, and whether all the shows, and there are quite a few in our industry, whether they all remain. Personally, I think Monaco will always remain. It is kind of the event of our calendar year. But whether some of the smaller shows don't have as much uptake, maybe, I don't know. I think that kind of remains to be seen. But I miss going to the shows, and I miss traveling, and I miss meeting and seeing clients and people that we work with. But fingers crossed,
I think in the long run, it'll be digital channels augmenting, the existing trade show setup, reaching new customers being able to view assets and meet advisors more easily. So hopefully it'll grow the pie. But have you seen this period bringing new customers in, new buyers in through charters up? I mean, we did a session with Nick and Tim Barber in the teeth of lockdown where we were talking about private jet charter increasing, creating new customers. Is that something you see in the yacht space?
Well, I think everybody knows charter was down last year, and I've heard percentages of up to kind of 60-70%. It took quite a big hit, but lots of the charters from last year have been postponed to this year, which is a really positive sign because they'll be performed this coming season. I was speaking to a charter broker recently, and she was telling me there's been a lot of interest from long-term charterers and from first-time charterers asking them to kind of shortlist options for the coming season, but no actual commitment yet. And I think that's because there are just too many variables at the moment. Will you need a vaccine passport? When are you going to get your vaccination? Will you need to quarantine this side or that side? And I think for some people, it's just too many moving parts. I think it will be a strong year for charter. And I did hear anecdotally about a long-term charterer who had to postpone their charter at the beginning of last year, in the beginning of the season, and then again at the end, and then the yacht was in the wrong place, so they were asked to take their charter in Croatia rather than France, or the other way around. And the charterer turned around to the broker and said, well, maybe I should just buy my own yacht. So I'm not saying it's a trend at all, but I think it goes to show that maybe there is that kind of impetus, or they will now consider buying, possibly.
Okay. You mentioned at the start about different types of vessel, different sizes and ages, and how does that impact your advisory process? Sort of things you look at for someone who is making a purchase.
So for us at Ints, we advise on all categories and sizes of yachts, whether it be a 30-meter at this end of the market, all the way up to the 100-meter plus, and everything in between, and the luxury tenders and everything that goes with. So as long as we're obviously not conflicted, then we're happy to advise and help anybody. Last year, we found there was a real steady stream of the kind of 40 to 60-meter market, both motor and sail, and we were acting for buyers and sellers. And we're currently instructed on a new build project, and I think that's quite important to mention, just because it shows that there are still projects out there that are moving ahead. That there are still people with liquidity to fund such construction projects. The yards are open and they're operating, albeit in a COVID secure environment, but there's willingness and desire on all sides to keep things moving and for projects to get underway.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Siobhan, for opening up the discussion today. Some interesting comments on the trends. Put your questions for Siobhan in the chat, and I can always bring them back to at the end. I just want to bring in Andrew Robinson, CEO of Ark & Co, who are a specialist debt advisor with a focus on marine assets, among other asset classes. Good afternoon, Andrew.
Good afternoon, David. How you doing?
Very well. So, financing is a key component in any ultra high net worth client strategy acquiring high value assets. Debt is historically cheap. I mean, what do you see across the market here for finance on marine assets?
Well, look, debt is cheap, but I don't think it's reflective of that in the marine market. It's a question that comes across all the time. People, want to borrow 1% on a yacht. It's really risk weighted. There's many different things. It's depreciating asset. There's repossession risk. And one discussion we always have is there's no real recorded sales values, which the brokers always argue against. But it creates big problems in the finance market. The finance market with yachting has been constant for the last decade. There's no real new entrants. There's no people which are leaving it. It's quite constant on which players are in there. It usually, the pricing, if you can look at an asset only kind of finance, you're usually between 3.5 to 4.5 as a margin. Which creates the issue with the family offices, because a lot of the family offices say to me that their internal return they want to get below on a debt borrowing is 3.5 to 4, and they're not interested in crossing over to private banking. Whereas if you're into private banking, you could go between 2.5 to 3.5. So there is a difference on rate arbitrage there, but it's always difficult to get what the family offices want to achieve in that sector. The finance market is very liquid at the minute, but it just depends on the asset type, the value, the yard, the age, the client profile, and the asset spread. And if those different variances come into play, with certain lenders, there's a lot of liquidity out there for them.
Okay, so I mean, does it often then come down to other assets like real estate, investment portfolios that could be secured against? In practical terms, when you're actually reviewing the case, there's other assets somewhere else to secure for the loan. I don't know.
Well, I think you wouldn't be buying a yacht unless you're in the high net worth area, and the general rule of thumb is you've got to have net liquidity of about 10 times the loan amount. So you're always talking with people with sophisticated structures, other investment portfolios. Anyway, it's just where they are in their life cycle. So the older purchasers may just don't care, they just want the cheapest rate, which would then go down the private banking route. Real estate wouldn't come into it. It's more about the investment portfolio. But then when you come further down, into people's 30s or 40s, then they have different strategies about how they're using their money and equity, and therefore they might want to pay a slightly higher rate to get a better return on equity.
Do you think that the absence of like Monaco Yacht Show and other trade shows has an impact on the industry? It's a very tight-knit group of people. Do you think it'll spring back in the way and people are itching for the return of those live trade shows? And what do they do for your business? Do they really have a big impact for you?
I think, and I'm saying with a smile as you asked the question with Siobhan as well, who doesn't want to attend the Monaco Yacht Show? It's the pinnacle of the yachting calendar, really, and it's a great event to go to. It's a big argument with it. For my business, I use it actually, I should watch that word, but I use it to build profile. We don't have a big global brand presence. So for us as a company, it is good for profiling. Do we get more business from it? Probably not. But if we're not there, people would ask questions. Why not? So I think attendance within those are key. I think they will change. The smaller events probably will stop. And in a positive way of what's happened, webinars like this, it's actually improved a bit of networking. So you can't beat in person, but the pace of networking has actually picked up a bit.
Okay, interesting. And some of the trends that Siobhan picked up on at the start around transactions, different categories, seeing steady demand in, is that something that, have you seen steady demand, or does the financing piece follow a different kind of pattern?
Yeah, it's not really, there's not many transactions I get involved with where they wouldn't buy cash and then we can refinance. Some people will say I won't buy without finance, but it's not always connected on there. If you ask most yacht brokers, and it's generally a good gauge, they had an extremely strong year last year. There was peaks and troughs, but a lot of them had very good years. You speak to a lot of the lenders, and to try and do a deal with them in Q4 last year was really difficult. They're probably because they were busy, but they were also filled their quotas for the year in quite blunt terms. So trying to get some money out of them at the end of last year was quite difficult. But they came back with a renewed optimism this year. The market was popular or is popular. I think what happened is I have a few clients which freedom has been taken away from them a bit with the situation that's happened. And they want to look at yachting to help that freedom expand a bit. So there's a trend that the yachting industry will benefit from that.
Okay, excellent. All right. Well, do put your questions for Andrew in the chat, and we'll bring him back on later for a discussion with all the panel before we head to breakout rooms. But thanks for that, getting us off and started. Jason Connon from Provenance Insurance Brokers. Good afternoon, Jason.
Good afternoon, David. Hi, everyone.
So when clients are, they've maybe been to see Siobhan, that they've got a target kind of asset in mind. They're starting talking to Andrew about some financing, looking at the insurance piece. What are the ways in which, what are the different types of options really, I suppose, for insurance? What are the things that people might get wrong, and how do you help advise clients in this area?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to state would be, can we get involved as early as Siobhan? The sooner the better.
Yeah, sure.
It's very different to organising insurance for a high value property or a supercar collection, which you could probably get through in a good day. So a programme for a super yacht, a larger vessel, would take a number of weeks, if not months, to get the complete programme. And that's off the back of connecting to some of the themes that have been mentioned. So we've a very hard market. The yacht market has been like that for a number of years, but the whole insurance industry is going through a hard market cycle, which essentially means premiums are going up and capacity is reducing. So there's less options to find an insurer who has appetite for yachts. And that's quite ironic because we've had quite a benign season, if not the last 12 months, not a lot of claims. So the claims ratio, the cost of claims is favourable at the moment, but the issue is capacity. So the options are reducing by the minute. So the more time we have to find the options, usually leads to Lloyd's of London, but the more time, the better.
And so there's a small number of specialist underwriters who will look at this, and you as a broker will help a client or family office navigate that degree of options to access, as you say, a contracting pool of people willing to look at this risk.
Yeah, that's exactly what we do in terms of our relationships with underwriters. So we work with, if it's Siobhan, Stage, Andrew, or any other professional service working on behalf of the client, then we'll go out to the market, albeit we're in a digital process at the moment. So that's even tougher because not ordinarily you could go around and speak to a number of people within a couple of hours. So the whole process is just taking much longer.
And what are the kind of claims that might come through for people? What are the key things that people insure against, or how does that factor through from a client, something going wrong, to a claim being called on the policy?
Yeah, well, going back to your earlier point, it's not just the vessel, so not just the hull. Again, looking at the super yachts, you're looking at the crew welfare, so more people on the boat. There could be higher value content such as fine art that could get damaged, and it's important not to assume that a fine art policy off the vessel, so if someone has a high value property fine art policy, it doesn't necessarily cover fine art that may be on the ship. So accidents can happen in terms of the contents. And even third party liability tend to be much higher limits on the super yachts because it can have guests who are of a similar background to the principal. So the claims costs are significant. So
the story of the Picasso on the wall in the yacht is not complete fiction. It's grounded in what actually goes on.
Yeah. So it can be at that level, albeit that one had some political background to it, didn't it? It was quite a heritage piece. So that's probably just outside the realms of insurance. But in terms of the process and what a broker should do is absolutely understand what is on the vessel, what are the contents, what are the detail behind them. And then if the scenarios arise, how can we help the client just resolve?
And as Andrew mentioned, I mean, you're not looking at buying a yacht unless you are ultra high net worth by definition. So you might also be looking after clients' other luxury assets, classic cars, property, other things. How would this kind of policy, how would the policy for a yacht dovetail into a broader strategy for a ultra high net worth family?
Yeah, it would help. It would help massively because it would present some history to the client profile, their attitude to risk. It would help tell the story to an underwriter around what they're underwriting and what they're accepting as a financial exposure. So if you have that history, the knowledge, and it's not just the yacht in isolation, that helps a lot.
And does it reduce the premium to have a sort of a cross? I mean, it makes sense that it would, but is that the practical experience?
Yeah, again, absolutely. If you can have the whole portfolio, then there can be adjustments based on one piece to offset the other, albeit the yacht insurance market is so small that there's a wider option with the rest of the assets. So finding the same kind of insurer that can overlap, that's the hard piece at the moment. But if that can be done, then yes, there's savings to be made for the client.
Okay, excellent. All right. Well, thank you for that, Jason. We're going to come on to Nick and Alex from PwC. If you have any questions for Jason, for Andrew, or for Siobhan, drop them in the chat and we can bring them back on. We'll bring them back into the discussion shortly. So, welcome, Nick and Alex.
Hi, David.
Nick, first question really for you. I know you're a specialist, very passionate about good governance amongst families and family offices. What do you think good governance means in the yachting and marine space?
Well, first thing, I just want to check that my reception is up to scratch.
It's perfect. Can hear you well.
Jolly good. So you're right. I am really passionate about this topic, and if you get me started, no one else is going to get a look in. And I'm all about the governance. That's why we're even in this space. When we started getting involved in luxury assets, art can be more complicated than you expect. There may be planes, but it is always the yachts that throws up the issues that people don't expect, and that with a degree of proactive governance, we might be able to head off at the pass. And art on yachts, it is a thing. Monet's on yachts, it is a thing. You wouldn't believe it, David. So that the whole world of luxury assets, and specifically yachts, is basically now fully on the radar of tax authorities across Europe and the UK. And so, because they're so complicated, I think that it's taking a step back from it and looking at it in the context of the wider tax advice. Paperwork, for me, is going to start being key in terms of that governance piece. Making sure you've got the right piece of paper to prove the right tax point at the right time to the right person is going to get you out of a number of different pickles. And Brexit is going to really shine a light on that, accentuating that point. Because everybody knows I'm really passionate about this, people get to hear from me a lot, which is why I brought one of my team members along with me, Alex. And so I've asked him to join me so he can maybe give an example to a couple of the points that I raise. So in terms of paperwork and specific situations where that's useful, Alex is just going to put some colour to it for everyone.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Nick. I guess really the point of having up-to-date paperwork and the emphasis on up-to-date is just to demonstrate that at any given time, and focusing on the EU, you're entitled to be in the EU without having to pay tax on the value of your hull again. And these are expensive assets, and a 20% VAT charge or a 22% VAT charge is an enormous liability to not have adequately mitigated. And really what we're doing by getting the right sort of paperwork is establishing our entitlement to be within the EU, so what's termed as proof of union status. I guess one of the other things that we see quite a lot is the necessity of that paperwork being kept up to date and being generated through conscious interactions with tax authorities at points like import and export, to build a sort of living trail of and justification for the yacht's VAT status at any particular time. And one of the reasons that's important is firstly, in operation, as Nick alluded to, we're going to see more and more of tax authorities taking a proactive interest in assets of this kind, especially now that there are two customs unions right next to each other. But also simply because from a governance perspective and from an eventual perspective of exit or life cycle of an asset and potential disposals, I think it's likely we're going to see buyers seeking to engage and understand the VAT status of vessels as well, to ensure that they don't inherit a potential liability when they subsequently import. And really the sort of gold standard paperwork that we're looking for is up-to-date import and export declarations. And it used to be the case that the industry took a sort of fairly relaxed view towards obtaining this on when they move in and out of the EU and other customs territories. So often these declarations would be made just by orally, for example. It would just be assumed. But increasingly we're seeing a necessity to actually engage with customs authorities, get the right paperwork, get documents like the single administrative document that demonstrates VAT has been paid, or something like the T2L, which would be fairly common to and familiar for those who've been involved in yacht transactions, which demonstrates that at any given time an asset is entitled to be there, it's in free circulation. That's the sort of paperwork we're looking for, and without it you risk potentially losing use of the asset while you try and establish your tax status, and potentially just undergoing an onerous exercise to collate it all historically, going back through 3 or 4 years of GPS data to try and otherwise justify your entitlement to be there. So that's why it's so important.
And this must be one of the major things that's tripping people up at the moment who are owning yachts. I mean, that getting that paperwork piece right, and the fact that everything has changed so quickly must mean that it's one of the things causing confusion. Yeah,
it is one of them. I mean, I think when you asked me what the two things, or a couple of things that are really tripping people up, for me in 2020, actually Siobhan, I must concur with her, the number of more buyers that are coming online. I don't know what people are doing to make their money in lockdown, but they've really done it, and a lot of British people. And there were a lot of British issues, UK taxpayer issues, that are tripping people up. And the reason that they're tripping people up is because they're not shared by the vast majority of traditional historic yacht owners, which, dare I say, have been non-UK people historically, and people who don't have HMRC breathing down their neck, who don't have particular bits of the tax law like benefit in kind taxation to worry about. They simply don't have to worry about it. And they don't have the same sort of sensitivities to the nature of structures that are used to buy and own yachts. For example, a company. Many people from some jurisdictions wouldn't have to think twice about whether to use a company or not. A UK taxpayer really does. And often UK taxpayers are relatively straightforward. A yacht might be their first foray into a non-UK structure. So is structuring your yacht purchase out of Malta, for example, while it's an amazing location and everybody down there knows exactly what they're doing, but it might not be right for a British person, and they may head off in completely an overcomplicated direction because that's what somebody suggested that they do. So there's a lot of trips for British people to get their heads around. And then with the paperwork thing, that's a VAT thing. So that's for everybody. And it's about this thing that I've written about VAT paid. There really is hardly a thing. There isn't a thing called VAT paid. If you buy a yacht, import it into the EU, and spend the rest of its operation sailing around in circles in the middle of the Mediterranean and hardly doing anything else, then you hopefully have a VAT paid yacht you don't need to worry about. But most yachts don't do that. Most yachts do huge amounts more than that, and then they're at risk of losing their VAT paid status. And Alex has been dealing with that for me recently, in terms of the surprises that can come up with that.
Yeah, I'd say it's a sort of useful heuristic in that it captures some of what's necessary in order to I suppose, secure against any potential VAT liability. At some point, you need, when you import an asset, and that doesn't matter whether it's a yacht or a sort of pallet of fruit and veg, you need to pay applicable duties on it and VAT. So in that sense, a yacht is just like anything else. The difference is that a yacht is a highly mobile asset, and it moves in and out of the EU, or any customs union, frequently within the course of its lifetime. And one of the challenges with VAT paid is it sort of presumes that one moment where VAT was first paid on the yacht, whether that's on acquisition of a new yacht or the first import that anyone has a record of, that's kind of the problem solved, and that from that point on, no further thought needs to be given to the yacht's VAT status. But increasingly, what's becoming clear from our interactions with clients and their interactions with customs authorities is that's not the case. It really does come back to this point around continuing to understand what is this yacht's VAT profile. So when I say VAT paid, what are the fundamental rules underlying this asset's operation, which mean that I'm entitled to be here without forking out millions of pounds to the tax authority. That might be because we're actually back in the EU, having previously left it under return goods relief. It might be because we're eligible for temporary admission. But without properly understanding that, you can't then prepare adequately to explain your situation to a tax authority, or continue to engage with them in order to safeguard your status, your VAT status, and mitigate any risk in future. So it's one part of the puzzle, but it's by no means sufficient.
Okay, thanks. And obviously hugely complex area. We've got some trustees on the call. If you have any questions, do pop them in the chat and we can bring them in at the end. But finally, just for Nick and Alex, I mean, what do clients need to consider when buying a yacht? Perhaps Nick, you can give us an outline of some of the things you would.
Oh, I need to consider. All of the above. Well, I suppose it won't be a surprise that I will say you need tax advice, and you need to think about what kind of tax advice you're getting. So do you know the difference between what is a commoditized sort of tax arrangement that's seeking to do a specific thing, the difference between that and bespoke tax advice, and the difference between that and implementing something, for example, importation. And when I try and advise our clients, what my job is to do is to empower them with enough information to be able to ask the right questions of the right people. So if I first say, when you're buying a yacht, has anybody mentioned tax yet? Has it even been mentioned? Because if it hasn't even been mentioned, we know, right, you need to empower yourself with the right questions to ask, because you've got to start asking questions. If somebody says, hey, I'm selling you a VAT paid yacht, you need to ask all the questions that Alex has risen, because what on earth does that mean? And frankly, will it still be VAT paid in your hands when you go off and do the thing that you want to do with it, which could be completely different to what the vendor was doing with it? And on the basis that it's unlikely the vendor really understands the tax status of the yacht they're selling to you, it's incumbent upon you to do the due diligence, throw tax into the due diligence of checking that the hull doesn't have a hole in it, in the same pot when you're buying that yacht. And I know that the due diligence piece, the things to look out for, is something that Alex it builds into a lot of the work that we do.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's a very established industry. And often that means that, well, everyone knows it very well, but if that means from a tax side, there's a sort of degree of familiarity with, sort of certain terms and certain means of acquisition without necessarily full consideration of the underlying mechanics. And one of the things we've been finding very useful and that we've been doing a lot for our clients is, as Nick says, just encouraging them to ask the right questions. So we had a client recently who was told that they couldn't export from France by their broker in a specific way. The reason being because no one does that. And one of the ways in which we helped in this the risk, we were acutely aware that the risk has increased in this post-Brexit environment. So we just gave them some questions to ask the brokers. So why does no one do that? What about doing it this way? Can you provide us with this document instead? none of which the broker offered, but the broker ultimately acknowledged that that was possible and that we can do it. And our, sort of position as tax advisors is then, well, we've got more documentation for our client, which means that then when they come back to the EU, they've got that additional, the additional form, which in this case was an INF3, to demonstrate that they are without any shadow of a doubt entitled to be sailing back in and not paying any import VAT. Whereas otherwise there would be a risk that they just don't have that, and there's a potential challenge at the other end from a tax authority. Okay,
many thanks for that. Very, very helpful. Obviously, hugely complex area of the VAT, and a live issue for many people watching in on this call. So just to bring in Grant Aitchison from IQEQ in the Isle of Man. Welcome, Grant.
Afternoon, David.
So just picking up on the theme we were chatting with Nick on good governance. I mean, you're the head of yachting and marine and aviation at IQEQ in the Isle of Man. And how do you see, good governance in the marine sector playing out from your perspective in the fiduciary and corporate services world?
I mean, for me, there are a number of different principles, obviously, which relate to good corporate governance. But as you say, in this particular sector, I think what's important is to be able to be, you have to be proactive, and you have to be able to effectively risk manage the situation. And you need to continually evaluate, because if you don't, we're talking about movable assets at the end of the day. And they're moving from within the Mediterranean, going to the Caribbean, constantly changing, rules and regulations are moving. So you need to be able to move and adapt quickly, assess situations, determine what needs to be done, talk to people such as the people that we've got on the panel, because there isn't anybody who knows everything about yachting and aviation. It just doesn't exist. Those kinds of people and organizations don't exist, and you need to have the right team around you to be able to refer to, work with, and communication is absolutely vital.
I mean, what are some of the sort of issues and problems you might be solving for, as operating these structures? I can imagine that they're very wide and varied, everything from, I guess, dealing with crew and HR and payroll and things like that, through to VAT, other issues. I mean, is it sort of every day is different in terms of new problems can come from anywhere?
Absolutely. I mean, everything you've just said happens, all the time. And we had a case, literally, I got contacted last night, actually, from one of our yacht managers that on a crewing matter, that said that one of the crew members has announced that she's become pregnant. The boat's a commercial charter vessel. It's in French Polynesia at the moment. I mean, so many things fall out of that, where you've got, as you say, health and safety on board the vessel. You've got the welfare of the crew member. How do you, in the COVID times that we're in, and I didn't really want to talk about COVID, but you've got a vessel that's in French Polynesia, a member that's fallen pregnant, and you suddenly have to work out, what do you do with that situation? So absolutely, there's a real life situation that just broke out last night.
And I guess you can't be a novice in that environment, can you? You've got to have strong network. You've got to have seen, there's got to be some things that you've seen before, haven't there? And the experience, the specialization of the fiduciary corporate services into these fields is because it creates, it's not a regular asset that you're managing, is it?
No, it's not. I think it certainly helps to have experience, because if you don't have an experience in that area, and I'm not going to put a time frame on it, but if you don't have an experience in it, then you can't manage things properly. You're not aware of it. You haven't got experience to draw upon. As you say, haven't got the network to pick up the phone to, whether it's on a tax issue, or a legal issue, or a management issue, to be able to have those conversations. Like the example I've just given there, pregnant crew member. I had never come across it before, but I knew exactly what we had to do as our role as directors of the owning vessel, of the company that owned the vessel, in order to then call upon people who were experienced and could advise on that particular point.
And I mean, obviously, you're based in the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man has a lot of professionals with a lot of this expertise. Do you see, as a sort of leading jurisdiction versus other jurisdictions around the world, or is the reputation, do you think, of the Isle of Man and the people that are there, I think, comes across to me as a very strong jurisdiction? What's your perspective on the strength of the Isle of Man in this space?
I mean, the Isle of Man is I think being an island certainly helps. I mean, we're passionate about the maritime world and sailing generally. I think that the super yacht industry began on the Isle of Man over 25 years ago. And from that, you can, over time, develop a very strong community. And there is a strong community here. At the end of the day, we have a very good flag state. We can walk down the road, literally, thankfully, we're not in lockdown, so we can literally walk down the road and talk to the people that write the regulations here. And we all speak with one another. It's about developing the brand of the Isle of Man. And I don't think it's isolated to the Isle of Man. I think it happens in all jurisdictions. I think if there's a desire to progress and enhance a particular service line or industry.
Okay, thanks. Well, before we go out to the breakout rooms, I just wanted to bring back in a couple of people on the governance point. I mean, Siobhan, obviously you're focused on the transaction, but I imagine some of the things you're talking about have a broader context. You're looking at how these assets are going to be managed over the long term, as well as completing the sale. How do you see some of the things that have been said during this session?
Oh, I mean, I know Nick and Grant well, and our paths have crossed over the years, and I agree with both of them. The point that Nick made about asking the right questions, I've had the same conversation with clients as well. You've got to ask the questions and ask them early, and the more information you have, the better armed you are. From a transactional point of view, it's always good to know what you're buying. From a governance point of view and from a structure point of view, obviously, we work with IQEQ in the past, and I think having an established corporate service provider in the client's team who work in this space is vital. You have to have people who know what they're doing, and I know that's been said before, but it's absolutely crucial. And yeah, I mean, good governance is just, that goes without saying. It's an absolute must.
And Jason, I mean, on the governance side, I mean, insurance is a key part of risk management. Understanding what is in policies, what the sort of situations are when policies will pay out is key. I mean, do you ever see disputes in policies paying out, or if people are well advised, well planned, paperwork's there, claims proceed, smoothly?
I can't say that we never see disputes in insurance. And in the yacht sector, you'll never get an all risks policy. So there'll always be something that is excluded. And if an incident happens, what's the peril, what occurred, what's the cost? So it'd be each case on its merits, and there's never two scenarios that are the same. But again, a broker's job is to minimize disputes or resolve disputes and act on behalf of the client.
It just occurred to me while Alex was explaining about the VAT position and documentation that the insurance piece, the documentation and having everything squared away as best you can, puts you in the strongest suit, doesn't it?
Yeah, and especially in a loss scenario, in terms of proof of assets, costs, valuations, all the things in terms of assessing quantum. So what's the cost of the claim based on the limits within the policy?
Okay, terrific. Well, we're going to head into our breakout rooms now, and we'll bring you back just before the hour, but hope you have a nice discussion.